I'm your MC, Gina Nakamura, she, her pronouns. Sansei, that means third generation Japanese American. Our agenda today will include our guest presenters, Frank Abe, graphic novel author, and Erin Shigaki, community artist. Tracy Furatani, North faculty, will give a brief historical overview, and the program includes a student voice and a Japanese poem. We are honored by your presence today. Please feel free to use the chat feature if you have comments or expressions. There's a lot of emojis in Zoom, or any questions during today's event. At the end of the event, there will be a survey link provided to win some of the donated Seattle College's prize packs, which include printed copies of the books talked about today, including printed copies of the book Unsettled, Resettled, Seattle's Hunt Hotel. Prizes will be mailed out to winners next week. But before we get started, we would like to start with a land and labor acknowledgement by Betsy Hasegawa, Associate VP for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion at South Seattle College.
Thank you, Gina. And it's great to be here. I think we have a really amazing program today. So, Iran Karate, greetings and welcome. So my name is Betsy Hasegawa, and I currently serve in leadership for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion at South Seattle College. I use she, her, and hers pronouns, and I'm Ainu and Japanese heritages. So Ainu are the first people of Japan, and we have an inseparable relationship to land and have been targeted by settler colonialism in Japan in parallel with other First People, Native people, Indigenous folks, and Aboriginal people globally. So we were also incarcerated during World War II. I'm a yes on one side of my family at Jerome, Arkansas, and no on the other side at Hart Mountain, then Tule Lake, and then as renunciants exchanged at sea for U.S. prisoners of war towards the end of the war. So as human beings, we've all lived with the land, and we're right now occupying land that's been cared for since time immemorial by the first people onward, who took up the charge from the Creator to care for the lands, waters, air, all the plants and creatures, and to honor the spirit of the lands, and to keep them in good shape for everyone for now and into the future. So our Seattle colleges are on lands that have been cared for by the many Coast Salish people of the Salish Seas, and we give honor, respect, and gratitude to them, past, present, and future, including the Duwamish, the Suquamish, the Muckleshoot, and many other people who currently have and will live, trade, and pass through these lands. We acknowledge that our colleges are sited on these lands because of broken treaties and forced removal. And for this Day of Remembrance event, I particularly want to acknowledge that there's a complex relationship that resulted in many World War II concentration camps for Japanese Americans getting built on land that was already stolen tribal land. We also want to recognize that enslaved and indentured people were forced into unpaid and underpaid labor in the construction of this country, state, and city. To the people who contributed this immeasurable work and their descendants, we acknowledge our and their indelible mark on the spaces in which we gather today. It's our collective responsibility to critically interrogate these histories, to repair harm, and to honor, protect, and sustain this land. And during this Black History Month, I want to thank and honor the many members of the Black community who stood up for us and recognized our incarceration as an act of racism rather than national safety. That means thank you in our Ainu language. And I want to give thanks to the Day of Remembrance organizing group from the 3 colleges. And my deep and enduring gratitude to my beloved colleagues who have held our colleges over the past 3 years as Associate Vice Presidents for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, Dr. Valerie Hunt at Central and Brother DeAndre Fisher at North. Thank you. So we have a wonderful event planned for today, and now I turn it back over to you, Gina. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Betsy. Now, Tracy Furatani, a North Seattle faculty, will give us a brief history lesson.
Yes, thank you, Gina, very much. And thank you, everyone, for coming. Appreciate the opportunity to share some of this work. Let me get my screen share here, correct? Okay, hopefully this will work. Sorry, my computer's being a little bulky, but Okay, so I'm at the wrong end of the thing, but this is actually an appropriate spot to start. I just wanted to thank the Day of Remembrance Planning Group, a very large group. And, without their help, none of this would have come together, and their leadership and organization. I also want to thank Anna-Pisi at South for funding our speakers. We have a couple of wonderful guest speakers, and we'll be hearing from them shortly. All right, so I'm going to just really do this quickly. So sorry, I have to go all the way back to the thing and I can't actually see what I'm doing. All right, there we go. All right, sorry about that. My name is Tracy Furatani. I teach physics at North Seattle College. I also serve on the Lake Forest Park City Council. And many decades ago, though, I was a history major, and I studied the Japanese American incarceration during World War II. And that's what we're doing the Day of Remembrance for today. The note on the language, we use the word incarceration intentionally. It's the act of illegally rounding up and isolating an entire group of people solely based on national origin and nationality. And so I have thanks to Frank Abe, I have this picture of the roundup happening in Seattle in 1942 of people from Bainbridge Island. You can see that soldiers are leading them. There are soldiers guarding the whole thing. And there's onlookers and other people witnessing it on the bridge above. The point is then that they were put into concentration camps, and we don't use that term lightly because it has other historical connotations, of course. But again, it is basically where you are segregated by your national origin or identity. This is a camp in Puszta, Arizona, 1943. The barrack-style housing is very typical. You saw that in the video earlier. That was of Hart Mountain. So the construction was basically very, very basic. Okay. So immigration in the United States has a long history, obviously. The nation prides itself on being a nation of immigrants. Surprisingly, until 1875, there were very few rules governing immigration, very few federal laws. And the ones that we had dated back into the 18th century. And of course, the idea was to populate the country, allow for growth and development, and essentially claim the land, again, basically against the wishes of many of the indigenous peoples that were here. All right, oops, yep. So the anti-Asian immigration legislation began in the late 19th century. As many of you know, Chinese labor was used to build a lot of the railroads in this country. And so the first rules were against the Chinese. And subsequently, of course, since labor was still needed in this country, other Asian peoples were enticed, drawn to the United States. With Japan specifically, Teddy Roosevelt entered into this so-called Gentleman's Agreement of 1907, in which basically there was no written rules, but it was understood that Japanese immigration would be restricted. And the point there is that it wasn't really so much a gentleman's agreement as basically the stick held over the Japanese government's head by basically legislation will be enacted if you don't agree to this. All right, so this continued into the Immigration Act of 1924, which essentially prevented Japanese from being naturalized. Of course, their children were citizens of the United States due to the right of birth. And male immigration was prevented. Actually, all genders were prevented from coming into the country after 1924. And it wasn't until 1952, after World War II, that some semblance of Japanese immigration was resumed. And it ended Asian exclusions, but it did not by any means equalize the treatment of peoples, especially from Asian countries. All right, and of course, this wasn't done in a vacuum. There was a strong anti-Asian sentiment in the West Coast, even in Seattle. And Miller Freeman, who you'll may be hearing about a little bit later, led basically the Washington's response to Asian immigration. And the point here is that basically, I picked this article because it was handy on the web, but this is not atypical of things that were happening in San Francisco, Los Angeles, Portland, and other West Coast cities. Okay, so as Betsy and Gina have mentioned, in 1942, February 19th, after the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, General John DeWitt of the Western Defense Command convinced the government that Japanese Americans were a threat to the US Pacific Coast security. And I love the reasoning that he used. The fact that nothing has happened so far in terms of Japanese actions by people living here against the US government is more or less ominous. So the absence of a threat was also perceived to be a threat. I think we see echoes of that today. And so the point is that when this order came down, you literally had about a month to get rid of all your stuff because it was literally what you could carry onto these trains. and along with your family, and you didn't know where you were going. In fact, the camps had not been created yet, so you were in temporary housing in places like, well, horse racing tracks, other large facilities that were used for animals. And so often a stable was your temporary home for a while. So the point was that the treatment was by no means any kind of luxury. All right, and people did fight back against this. Gordon Hirabashi and Fred Korematsu were two famous names fighting the order that came down, and the US Supreme Court upheld it. And finally, in 1983, their convictions on which they were making their appeals was overturned by the US Ninth Circuit Court. And the fact was that the government had withheld several documents that pointed out the Japanese Americans were not a threat. And I'm going to illustrate that with a story from my family in a bit. Okay, so what does this order mean? What it meant was that if you lived in any of these shaded areas, that you were evacuated. That was the what is the word term used to describe what was happening to this forced relocation of all these people. And you were eventually sent to one of these camps. There are 10 facilities in which the incarceration was occurring. And you notice that some of them, ironically, were in part of the exclusion zone. So the government was finding places which were empty. That is to say, basically probably taken from Native American peoples, and basically placed huge facilities, often containing up to 7,000 to 19,000 people in an area that had no infrastructure. So it did take a while for all this to be reconstructed. And of course, many of these areas actually are National Historic Sites today, and you can visit kind of the remains of what's there. Okay, so what culture that was in the camps was created by the residents. In other words, the people who are incarcerated. Isamu Noguchi is a famous architect, post-war architect, but during the incarceration, he was creating works out of plastic and other materials that were found objects in the camps. And I think this is something that really speaks to me, because it is kind of the human spirit living on what you can find, and basically trying to understand the experience you're going through art. And we'll hear a little bit about that from one of our guest speakers. And wanted to point out the incarcerated were not a unified political force by any means. I mean, sure, everybody didn't like what was happening, but depending on where you were born, when you were born, your attitudes towards what was happening was different. And so in 1943, all adults in the camps, even those that were not eligible for citizenship because of that naturalization law, were sent the Statement of U.S. Citizen of Japanese Ancestry form, also known as the Loyalty Questionnaire. Famously, questions 27 and 28 asked if you were willing to serve in the armed forces, and were you going to swear unqualified allegiance to the US. And if you answered no to both of these questions, you were likely to be sent to the Tule Lake Segregation Center, as it was called, which was reserved for the quote unquote disloyal. And about 20% of the incarcerated answered no to these questions, and it really varied. It was 2% at Minidoka, where many of the Pacific Northwest Japanese were incarcerated, and a high of 50% in Manzanar, where many of the San Francisco Japanese were incarcerated. Okay, and it turns out that my grandfather was one of the no-nos. Really briefly, Soichi Furatani is my grandfather, and he was age 52 at the time the incarceration occurred. He's a farmer in El Monte, California, which is in the Los Angeles area. Notably, his civic involvement was literally just being the treasurer of the local Japanese language school, because like many immigrants, the parents decided that it was important to pass along their culture through language to their kids, and so that's what he did. So I'm going to show you kind of his travels. All right, so in March 1942, a month after the order came down, he was put into the Latuna Detention Center. Now, this is not normal. Because he was civically involved as a treasurer for this local Japanese school, he was considered to be a dangerous enemy alien, and so he was segregated into this particular facility. He was actually in LA County Jail until they figured out where to stick him, and they stuck him here. The Spanish consul, of all people, would come over to this detention center and check to make sure that the prisoners were being treated all right and that kind of stuff, and letters could be exchanged and that kind of thing. But that was only for 2 weeks. In April 1942, he was sent to the detention center in Santa Fe, New Mexico, run by the FBI. And there he was processed, and that's his processing card. And the fact is that I think he was, it's in the same clothes that he had been in for the past month. So he's looking kind of disheveled here. And this was one of those tactics that was used by the war authority to justify, well, these are shifty type of people. The FBI report at that time said that he was an officer of the Japanese Institute of South El Monte, which makes it sound much grander than it is, reportedly indirectly under the control of the Japanese government and engaged in disseminating Japanese propaganda. This was their justification for incarcerating him in this special facility. All right, in June 1942, he was transferred to Lordsburg detention facility. And literally it was because the family started making sync. At this time, my family was actually in the stables at San Anito's racetrack down in Southern California, just before they transferred to Heart Mountain, Wyoming. And the point was that they were basically saying, well, I want my dad back. And who can blame them? So in fact, basically they had to find other justifications, and that's why he was moved to Lordsburg, where he was subjected to further interrogation, adding that he was too ignorant to hold an office. He was a member of this parents' board of the Japanese language school, trying to make him really basically seem like he was hiding something. Though they do conclude the board also stated subject impressed it as a rather simple farmer type of Japanese with strong Japanese sympathies, as if basically that was another justification for moving him around these facilities. All right, so by a year later, I think, this really speaks to how harsh the incarceration was. I think he basically felt that he had to submit to some degree. He decided that, yeah, the US wasn't treating him right, so he really did want to return to Japan. You'll see the term repatriation occasionally, and that's what that means, that, yeah, the people who were in the camps were given the option to return to Japan. He decided to take them up on it. And at this point, he's just interested in peace, doesn't care whether Japan or the US wins the war. So you can see that there's been a shift in perhaps his Japanese sympathies attitude, at least according to the authorities. All right, so he was finally able to rejoin his family 2 years later in April 1944 at Heart Mountain. And it was thanks to actually some folks in the community, non-Japanese folks, who were able to come to his aid and submit letters like this that said, yes, I know Soji Furatani from way back when. He's been a good customer of mine, very loyal, hasn't said anything bad about the US. And there was actually, I think this is an underplayed story. And if I had grad students, I'd really want to basically have them work on things like, the non-Asian support, non-Japanese support for basically the people who were in these camps. Okay. So a month later, because of the fact that I think I mentioned the loyalty questionnaire, he had answered no. And the reason he answered no was different than many other people's. He truly believed that basically going back to Japan was the right idea. So of course he wasn't going to say yes to either of those questions. So he basically was put into what was called the worst of the worst, the Tule Lake Segregation Center. And there you can see the picture that I have here is one of the Tule Lake riots. There were basically many disturbances there where people were accusing each other. And this was the devious thing the government did, which was literally in the segregation center were still some incarcerated who had answered yes and yes to the questionnaire, but just happened to be in the camp as it was being turned into a segregation camp. So you can imagine there were some fights over that. And so the point was basically there was a lot of suspicion amongst the people in the camp, rife basically with tension. And so he couldn't wait to get out of there either. So the first boat, literally, the war ends in September 1945. In December 1945, the first ship that carries the repatriated back to Japan, the USS William H. Gordon, goes to Tokyo. And the story goes, my grandfather was convinced until he was literally in Tokyo that the Japanese had won the war. And he pointed out that on the USS William H. Gordon, they were being fed food that was far better than what's in the camps. And he said, yes, because they're treating us as the victors of the war, right? So he gets to Tokyo, he gets off at the port, and he sees scenes like this. You can see the destroyed buildings in the back as a result of the bombings during the war. You can see people essentially begging out front. And the point is that he actually stopped by one of these small stands that you see off to the left there to have a bunch of soba noodles. And the moment he bit into those, he realized that Japan had lost the war because the quality was so poor. And this is my uncle's story, so it may be apocryphal, but nevertheless kind of shows you the attitude that some of the Issei had. Anyway, there's my thank you for the group. I appreciate taking a little bit extra time, but I really wanted you to have a bit of a background in case you didn't know some of the story. So I'm tossing it back to China. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Tracy. And thank you for sharing the story, that connection with your family as well. Without further ado, I would like to introduce Frank Abe, who is the lead author of the new graphic novel, We Hereby Refuse. Japanese American resistance to wartime incarceration, which dramatizes the full range of resistance inside America's war-torn concentration camps, presenting an original vision of America's past with disturbing links to the American present. He wrote, produced, and directed the award-winning PBS documentary, Conscience and the Constitution, that's a tongue twister, on the Heart Mountain Fair Play Committee, the largest organized resistance to the incarceration of Japanese Americans. Abe helped produce the first ever Day of Remembrance in 1978 with Frank Chin and Lawson Inada, and together they invented a new Japanese American tradition by producing car caravans and media events in Seattle and Portland that publicly dramatized. I'm having a speech impediment day. The campaign for redress. The Days of Remembrance are now observed annually wherever Japanese Americans live, like we are doing all here together today virtually. Professionally, Abe served 14 years as a reporter for the Cairo News Radio and 25 years as a communications director for the King County executives Gary Locke and Dow Constantine and the Metropolitan King County Council. In those capacities, he served as national vice president of the Asian American Journalists Association and taught broadcast writing at Seattle University. Frank Abe.
Thank you, Gina, and thank you, Tracy. That was really a wonderful overview of the incarceration, and thanks for your personal story as well. So the question's been asked on this 80th anniversary of the government action that sent our parents and grandparents into camp. Where are we now? And you would think that since the government has recognized and apologized for this massive violation of civil liberties in the American 20th century and awarded a token redress, you would think that things were made right. That Asian Americans, African Americans, Latinos, indigenous peoples, LGBTQ, that everyone would have a safe and secure space in the America of today. Yet we can see that at Seattle colleges and campuses nationwide, or just walking down the street or taking the subway in New York, that some of us are still targeted for the way we look or made to feel like we don't belong, still the foreigner, still the other. That's a fact, but it really shouldn't be, because as I'll show you, I hope, students of Japanese ancestry, for one, have a long and colorful history at Seattle Central College. This is a history that dates back to before the war, before World War II. And that history includes the stories of 4 students whose stories are intertwined with the resistance history of Japanese America. I'm going to now share the screen. And I'll weave these stories through the story of camp resistance as told in my recent graphic novel, We Hereby Refuse, and as documented in the PBS film you mentioned on the draft resistance at Heart Mountain. And as we experienced at the birth of the redress movement and reparations for the camps, the creation of the first Day of Remembrance here in Seattle. And these stories can be traced to points of time here at Seattle Central, which you might know was built on the site of the old Broadway High School. Now, for Japanese Americans, Broadway High School was the place to be in the late 1930s. At that time, before the war, 25% of the student body of Broadway High was Nisei, second-generation Japanese Americans. 1 of every 4 students was a person of Japanese ancestry and a citizen by virtue of birth here in Seattle. And you can still recognize part of the old high school architecture in what is now called Broadway Performance Hall. So James Omura was born on Bainbridge Island as Utaka Matsumoto, but he didn't get along with his father, and he left for Seattle and school at Broadway High. He basically reinvented himself as James Omura, and after graduation left for San Francisco and Denver, where he edited this newspaper, the Rocky Shimpo, and I'll return to that in a moment. A few years later came a boy whose parents ran a hotel in Pioneer Square, John Okada. From an early age, John saw himself as a poet and a writer, and he threw himself into his studies at Broadway High. Shy, retiring, and industrious was how his Latin teacher described him. So 10 years after the war, John Okada would write, and this is his high school, his sophomore vice president picture. But 10 years after the war, John would write the great Japanese-American novel, No Boy. And he would base the central character of his novel on this young man, Jim Akutsu, Hajime Jim Akutsu, an athlete, many sports, who was a few years ahead of John. So he lived on First Hill, and his folks ran a shoe repair business in Chinatown. Finally, Kazuko Itoi was another Nisei in the student body whose parents ran a Pioneer Square hotel. Little did she know that 5 years after the war ended, she would publish one of the first Japanese-American camp memoirs called Nisei Daughter, under her married name Monica Sone. So as Tracy described, and as you saw in the videos, the president signed the executive order, and Okada, Okutsu, and Monica Sone, their families lost everything. Shoe repair shop they lost, the hotels in Pioneer Square, but they obeyed the army orders. They had no choice. They did not protest removal. They were taken first, Tracy mentioned horse stalls, they were taken first to the Puyallup Assembly Center, the site of the Western Washington Fairgrounds, the racetrack there, and then taken to the camp at Minidoka, Idaho. But after 2 years of imprisonment, Jim Akutsu did protest the army order to draft military conscription of the Nisei from camp. There was a lot that Jim was angry about. The lack of due process in being put in camp in the first place, the denial of due process, equal protection under the law, as guaranteed by the Constitution. But what really made Jim Akutsu mad was getting a new draft card after Pearl Harbor, reclassifying him and other Nisei from 1A to 4C, or enemy alien. He and others took this as a kind of backhanded way of stripping them of their U.S. citizenship, a very chilling idea at the time. Jim read in the newspaper about how opposition to the draft was growing at the camp at Hart Mountain. Mass meetings were held there to discuss breaking the law, breaking the Selective Service Act, in order to get a test case into court. Now, these men organized as the Fair Play Committee. They were not anti-war activists or anti-war pacifists. They were ready to serve, ready to fight for their country, so long as their rights were first restored and their families released from these camps. They saw this as their last chance to get a case into court to challenge the underlying constitutionality of mass incarceration based solely on race. Akutsu read headlines like this one in the Rocky Shimpo newspaper. So he wrote to the editor, who was, guess who, James Omura of Broadway High School. Omura wrote back that he admired the Fair Play Committee in the fact that it was organized, that they took a stand as a group and issued manifestos of principle based upon the Constitution. And Omura said, if you guys at Minidoka want to protest, you should organize, not go it alone. But that kind of organization just didn't happen at Minidoka. Jim, his brother, and his others resisted the draft on their own, each individually. The Hart Mountain resistors were convicted as a group. The Minidoka resistors were tried one by one, but by a kind of a kangaroo court where basically the same jury pool, the same jury heard each case and went out for a smoke before coming back 5 minutes later to render their guilty verdicts. And many of these men from both camps, Hart Mountain and Minidoka, served 2 years at the federal penitentiary at McNeil Island, west of Tacoma. Now, after serving his sentence, Jim returned to Seattle and reunited with his friend John Okada, who had served in the Army in the Pacific, didn't know anything about what was happening here in the camps. So over dinner and drinks, Jim spilled out his story of draft resistance in prison, or John Okada was taking notes during this time. And he drew from Jim's experiences to write his novel, No Boy. No Boy, the novel ends with several tragedies, after which his draft resistor character cannot see what comes next for Japanese Americans after the war. All he can see is what he calls a faint glimmer of hope. So neither John nor Jim could foresee how the spirit of resistance would go kind of underground for 35 years. Those were long years, folks, in which guys like them worked hard, raised their families, raised kids like me, and set aside their grievances with the government for 35 years. until around the mid-70s, 1978, when a group of Nisei engineers at Boeing would awaken the conscience of Japanese America with what it called an appeal for action. So the Seattle JACL, Japanese American Citizens League, was called the Maverick chapter back then. Maybe still is now, for all I know. And its evacuation redress committee was led by, on the left there, Shosuke Sasaki seated and Henry Miyatake standing. These flip charts were like the PowerPoint of the 1970s. These guys, in fact, recruited me and others to help them organize what was called a Day of Remembrance, kind of a bit of street theater reality. This was the poster that we tacked up on telephone poles and in bowling alleys like Imperial Lanes, just like the Western Defense Command did in 1942. This design is superimposed over a ghost image of the original poster, the instructions poster, with language that was calibrated to signal that this was not just a commemoration, that the operative words are on top there. Remember the concentration camps, stand for redress with your family. So this poster invited people to join in recreating the expulsion from Seattle with a car caravan, as Gina said, down Interstate 5 to the Western Washington Fairgrounds, right? The site of the old Puyallup Assembly Center. This was the logo that we commissioned for the event. The bars in the center just signifying, first, second, Ichi San, first, second, and third generation Japanese Americans, unified by the outer circle, twisted around with a barbed wire of camp. Both the poster and the logo were designed by a graphic arts instructor here at Seattle Central College, Mr. Frank Fuji. Frank would say the barbed wire represented the camps, the injustice of camps, and on the day that we won redress, the barbed wire would come off. So we had the event organized. We had a sense that people were interested by the number of phone calls we were getting, but nothing prepared us for the crowd that flooded the parking lot of Sick Stadium, Rainier and McClellan. It felt like the entire community poured out to remember the camps and stand for redress with their families. So many people showed up, we struggled to sign everyone in. Comedian Pat Morita flew out to do a little stand-up comedy. The actor Mako came to show his support. And I wish I had a photograph of Monica Sone at the event, but she returned to Seattle just to say how proud she was to support redress for the camps, Monica Sone. Now, the line of cars stretched down Interstate 5 toward Puyallup as far as the eye could see. And inside these cars, the memory of leaving Seattle in 1942 triggered something inside the Nisei. Parents were opening up to their children about what happened to them during the war, many for the first time. Anthropologist Yasuko Takazawa called it the event that burst open the tomb of Japanese American history. Two follow-up events brought the issue back home to Seattle Central. To keep up the drumbeat for redress, we organized a cross-state humanities symposium the following year that kicked off the full day at Broadway Performance Hall. And the year after that, we put enough pressure on Congress that it created a fact-finding study commission, the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians, which held a regional public hearing on the stage of Broadway Performance Hall. And testifying to the commission was Hajime Jim Akutsu, former Broadway high school student, saying that his appearance before the panel felt like picking up on unfinished business from 40 years before. James Omura also came out from Denver to testify at the Seattle hearing. We were shocked. Frank Chin thought that he was dead. Myself, as a sansei or third generation, like Gina said, I also testified to the popular support for redress as evidenced by the 2,000 people who came out for the first Day of Remembrance. I think Stan Shikuma took this photograph for the Asian Family Affair, but maybe he can correct me later. So within 10 years of that first Day of Remembrance, Congress passed the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, and President Reagan signed it. The government apologized for violating the Constitution during World War II and paid each living incarceree a token compensation of $20,000 each. Not for property losses, mind you, but for the violation of civil liberties and constitutional rights. So from that activism, which took place here at Seattle Central College and elsewhere, we held the United States government accountable. We've come a long way from that first day in 1978. But while a day of remembrance is often observed as a commemoration or a time for reflection, I want you to know that it was founded in the heat of political pushback. It was always about taking action. And over the past 40 years, I've been very pleased to see communities use the Day of Remembrance as a rallying point to stand with other targeted groups. And if I can paraphrase the final pages of our graphic novel, our government was wrong to single out Japanese Americans for exclusion and incarceration based solely on our race. It was wrong then, and it is wrong now. And fortunately, whenever we see America turn against a people because of their race or their religion or their immigration status, Japanese Americans have shown that we won't just stand by. We won't just go along. We will speak up. We're saying that every person deserves a fair hearing before removal or detention. We're saying no children should be separated from their families, from their parents, just as after Pearl Harbor, many of our fathers were separated from their families. We're being the friends we didn't have when we needed one the most. 80 years ago, it happened to us. And every year on days of remembrance like this one, we're saying we refuse to let it happen again to anyone else. Thank you. Gina, back to you.
Thank you, Frank. I know virtually you cannot hear applause right now, but I would ask everyone to give some silent snaps or use the applause emoticon inside of Zoom to show love every time a presenter shares with us. Now we would like to highlight a student voice. This is a student's family's experience with the camps. However, he is not able to be here today, so I am going to read his bio for you. I'm Simon Kiyan, he, him pronouns, attend Seattle Central, and I'm not Japanese American by blood. I'm adopted from Far East Russia, but I'm half Asian and was adopted into a Japanese American family. Even though I am not Japanese American, I have always been told stories by my mom and family who have been through the internment camps. There are still 3 family members alive who were in them, and I'm always more than willing to spread my family's story. Thank you so much for letting me attend Seattle College's Day of Remembrance event. I apologize I cannot be there in real time, but nevertheless, here is my family's story.
My grandfather's name was Kiyan. He was born in Berkeley, California in 1913 and grew up in Southern California with his parents who immigrated from Japan and his 6 brothers and sisters. After the bombing of Pearl Harbor in 1941, he and his family were forced to leave their home. They initially went to the Pomona Fairgrounds, which was turned into an assembly center. They slept in converted horse stalls until the internment camps were built. They were sent to Hart Mountain, Wyoming, where they stayed until March of 1946. My grandfather was 28 years old and lived there with his parents, siblings, and 2 young nephews. During his internment, he worked doing construction of nearby boom towns and harvesting sugar beets in nearby farms. Not long before they were sent to the internment camps, my grandfather and his brother bought land to farm and live on. When Executive Order 9066 was issued, many landowners and business owners had to sell their businesses and property for very little. My grandfather was very fortunate to have white friends and colleagues who took care of his property and rented the farm to pay mortgage. So my grandfather was able to return his family to their home after the war and pick up life. My grandmother was Fumi Kitahara. She was born in Auburn, Washington in 1921. She lived in Auburn with her parents and 8-year-old brother. when Executive Order 9066 was issued. They were first sent to an assembly center in Pinedale, California. They were sent to the internment camp in Tule Lake, California. A year later, the family was sent to Heart Mountain, Wyoming. My grandmother, however, applied through some churches to work in Chicago, Illinois. She worked there as a housekeeper until 1946 when she reunited with her family and moved to Southern California. The story that she told my mother, and she's told me, that created the strongest image was when they were in the train from Auburn to California. The tracks went by their farm. My grandmother looked out of the train window and could see their horse standing in the middle of the field. My great-grandparents were in their 50s and 60s when they were interned. Their careers were interrupted, and it was near impossible to start again when they returned. After the war, my grandmother would take her little brother on the bus into downtown Los Angeles so he could be around white people and not be afraid.
Okay, and moving right along, I would like to introduce Erin Shigaki, a Yonsei, that means fourth generation, Japanese American born and raised in Seattle, like me. She creates murals and installations that are community-based and focused on BIPOC experiences, often the World War II mass incarceration of her own community. She's passionate about highlighting similarities between that history and systemic injustices communities of color continue to face today. She's keen to understand intergenerational trauma and to explore the emergence of beauty and intimacy despite unspeakable harsh circumstances. And she believes that wielding art and activism to tell these stories can educate, redress, and incrementally heal. Erin is also a community activist and runs an annual pilgrimage to Minidoka, an American concentration camp where her family was incarcerated. She is active with the Tsuru for Solidarity, a nonviolent direct action abolitionist project of the Japanese American social justice advocates. She also serves on the board of Look, Listen, and Learn, a public access television show that inspires and advances early learning in young children of color. All of this work is fundamental to her artistic practice. Thank you, Erin.
Thank you, Gina. And thank you, Simon, for sharing your family story and for digging into those really powerful moments. And good afternoon, beloved community. I want to express my deep gratitude to the Caring Coalition of Seattle Colleges, staff, faculty, and students for this opportunity. And of course to Frank Abe, who has consistently blazed this path and provided knowledge for people like me to make our art with. I'm going to start to share now. Me minimize. So I came into this work of telling this story by my birth. I am a descendant of World War II incarceration survivors on both sides of my family. And 44 years ago, my parents took me and my sisters to the first day of remembrance that Frank mentioned, and which he was so instrumental in organizing. And I remember looking around at all of the familiar community faces, but not understanding the powerful urgency in the room. However, my parents knew somehow that it was important for us to be there. And then in my 8th grade Washington State history class, I saw that there were 2 paragraphs about the mass removal and incarceration of my community. So for my class report, I decided to ask both of my grandmothers about it. And they spoke. Nothing emotional, just very matter-of-fact details on daily life. And importantly, they shared without bitterness. It wasn't until years later that I realized how rare this was. So many community members were silent in their shame and pain. My grandmothers knew how monumentally important it was to tell me when I asked. Here are photographs of just a few of the dozens of my relatives who were imprisoned in the Minidoka concentration camp in southern Idaho. My grandmother Yasuko holds my father, John, who was born there, delivered by a horse veterinarian. And my grandmother Mitsuko and grandfather Sego were matched and married there. Here's a photograph of my great uncle Shio, great aunt Chiseko, and second cousins Amy and Haruko on the day they returned to their Beacon Hill home from Minidoka. The experience did not end when they exited the prison gates. In the handful of years since I returned home to Seattle after time living in Brooklyn, I have found welcome and regrounding in the Asian Pacific American community that I was raised in. After joining my parents on our first pilgrimage to Minidoka, which was the first time that my dad returned there, I became active with the all-volunteer group which runs the pilgrimages. And on the right are those two second cousins who were pictured in that infamous Beacon Hill photo. I work with Students for Solidarity, as Gina mentioned in my bio, and I am just so pleased to be part of both organizations that offer layers of engagement, among them education and healing. So when my eyes were first opened to the possibility of working in public art, thanks to the City of Seattle Office of Arts and Culture, who put on a terrific public art boot camp, I already knew what stories I wanted to tell. My ancestors are my heart. I tell these stories to honor their resilience, resistance, and survival. I work with historic images on paper and in the digital space. I join images and painted elements. I make ceramics and community-sourced installations. I want you to have time to read that amazing quote by Dr. Washington, who I think of as one of my spiritual guides. And I also experiment with materials that are new to me, such as stone. My ancestors are my heart. I tell these stories because it's undertaught and often erased history. Indeed, these histories are still being erased. At this very moment, the sanctity of Minidoka is being threatened by a proposed wind farm of some 400 windmills over 700 feet tall. For reference, that's taller than the Space Needle, as you'll see in that graphic. It would nearly surround the Minidoka National Heritage Site, which is a dedicated national park. A project like this would never be proposed at the Grand Canyon, at Arlington National Cemetery, or Mount Rushmore, etc. In the words of another community leader, Larry Matsuda, quote, "But LS Power feels that this historic site, which holds truth about America, is a prime target for desecration," unquote. And so we fight to protect the physical manifestation of what our ancestors survived. And let me take some time to talk about an erasure incident closer to home. 2 years ago, words I wrote about supremacist Bellevue land tycoon and vocal anti-Japanese, anti-Asian agitator Miller Freeman, who Tracy mentioned, were first censored from my art label for some sculptural work at a Bellevue Arts Festival. The incident was covered up, and I and allies labored for months to bring it to light. So a few months later, when Asian American Pacific Islander professors from Bellevue College approached me about creating a piece for their campus, I thought, all right, my work is to tell this history, and that includes the information about Freeman. I did so for the sake of truth-telling and for the Bellevue Japanese American ancestors who cleared the land when no one else would, and who were swept up in a hate campaign when they became too successful on the land. I did so to point out that the same family, headed by property developer Kemper Freeman Jr., today remains a powerful force in Bellevue. I did so to remind folks that America's racial policies have always had many economic motives and beneficiaries. When the Freeman lines were literally whited out by a high-level administrator of color, the APA staff and students organized and protested loudly. I didn't realize how many battles these folks had already been in to dismantle white supremacist culture on their campus. They were primed. And then the Japanese American community rallied. I think it's important to share that this was a moment where I felt the intergenerational trauma of the incarceration like a dirty knife. That trauma made me doubt that I deserved, that we deserved a gathering, a reckoning, apology. Community leaders gently guided me toward the idea of a remembrance ceremony on our terms. And the community and allies showed up to stand up for me, for us, and for our truth, and for our place in this country. It felt like the swell of people we needed in 1942. And that's what we do, isn't it? When not blinded by supremacist divisiveness, communities of color gather, use our medicine, give mutual aid, and call for justice and healing. That day, one of our community members and leaders, Stan Shikuma, talked about the 3 R's. To remember, not for recrimination, but because we must not repeat this history. We remember for our children. To restore spirit, unity, the value of people, and our trust in leadership. And to rededicate. Although promised, closure did not happen for me or the AAPI community, and they still continue to struggle at Bellevue College. Stan said, quote, rededication is when we begin the hard work of recommitment to what it means to be an American citizen, a permanent resident, an undocumented person, or a marginalized person. This is when we test and retest whether we are upholding a society where all people are created equal. My ancestors are my heart. It follows that I tell these stories so that my community can heal from these traumas so tightly intertwined with the history of legislation and propaganda against Asian people. My ancestors are my heart. What happened to Japanese Americans during World War II rhymes so strongly with what's happening to migrants today, where innocent people are being detained in terrible conditions, where people who do what we're now calling essential work are being tossed away. Our World War II incarceration is also linked to this country's obsessive history of incarcerating BIPOC bodies. We as Japanese Americans have a moral imperative to tell our story because of the way that our history echoes today. It is difficult for all of us to acknowledge anti-Blackness within us, and it has been particularly painful for me to see it within my own community, which was literally rounded up and jailed en masse. We Asian Pacific Americans have been fed the false constructs of the model minority myth and have been kept apart from our Black, Brown, and Indigenous siblings by a white supremacist notion that we're closer to white. Yet during the COVID-19 pandemic, we once again have seen how false that status is as xenophobia and hate is stirred by unfortunate leaders. My ancestors are my heart. In service of holding the balance between atrocious histories and the preciousness and strength of our beings, I plan to keep making work that invites people to reclaim the American narrative. I want the truth about the United States to be told, that this country was built on the backs of Black, Indigenous, and people of color. It continues to be undercover, underwritten, and under-discussed in our educational system. We need to be accountable for our sins, no matter how painful. I love America. I'm so glad I'm American, but we have done some dirty deeds, and there's nothing wrong with calling it out because that's what's required for healing. Now, do you all know the work of Emory Douglas? He is the legendary graphic designer for the Black Panthers, and I had the joy and privilege of taking a class with him last year, and I learned about his political artist manifesto containing so much richness and truth. And I just want to share with you a couple of points of many that resonate with me. And number 9, create art that challenges the colonization of the imagination. Number 12, do not lose sight of what the goals are. My ancestors are my heart. My goal and purpose is to tell the Japanese American story in memory of my ancestors and in service of the liberation of all people. What kind of ancestors do we want to be? Thank you for your time. Keep in touch and take good care of one another.
Thank you very much, Erin. Please continue to use the chat to express your comments and feelings. We would now like to end our programming today by a reading of a Japanese poem read by Dr. Valerie Hunt, daughter of Murdy Hunt and ancestor Richard Hunt, tenured faculty and steward of the beloved community of Seattle Central College.
Good rising, beloved community. May your day be well. May your night be well. And all the moments in between. May your day and night be well, because no day is promised and life is unpredictable. I was honored by our community to bring myself into a place of meditation with the ancestors. And this is the offering that the ancestors gave to me to give to our beloved community. Preclarity, dedicated to the children who will remember if we tell them. Is memory a threshold and forgetfulness a tomb? When we labored in the vineyards of citizenship, paying taxes, voting in all the elections, keeping the lawn trimmed and tidy and beautiful, sending our children to school with pencil boxes and sandwiches and names like Victor and Anna. A Janus face amulet of protection, one face in the past in honor of our ancestors, and one face forwarded in hope, anticipating the future. One believed in the fruitfulness of citizenship, like the harvest of strawberries, rich, expansive, and fragrant. One believed in the bonds of citizenship. Hello, neighbor. Planting season is coming soon. Hello, neighbor. You needing to borrow my tractor? No rush. I know you'll bring it back. But not in time to hear me and my family's crying in fear, grabbing what possessions we could before other citizens drove us to detention camps, then dusty barren fields, then locking us up, imprisoned by our fellow citizens, with citizens in watchtowers, their guns pointing inward toward us, knowing our citizenship was not bulletproof. In the aftermath of 2 generations, no longer incarcerated, no longer at home, when we remember the fiction of our citizenship, we cross the threshold into a house of horrors. Some of us would rather forget. E pluribus unum can cover a multitude of sins. Some of us long to remember what was forgotten and take the sharp edge of that memory and cut away at the fiction of being a citizen to reveal the true possibility of belonging. Ashe, ashe, ashe. Thank you for listening to my words. This is dedicated to the children who will remember if we tell them.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hunt. And I would like to thank each and every one of you for attending this event today. We are honored by your virtual presence. And I would like to draw special thanks to the Day of Remembrance Committee. It is made up of students, staff, and faculty from the Seattle colleges. And my screen just went away. And special thanks to the anti-Immigrant program at South Seattle College for funding our guest speakers today. Also in the chat, I have put a link for a survey. If you would like to win a Seattle College's prize pack, which includes printed hard copy books related to today's topic, please fill out the link in the chat. I will post it a couple more times. And now we open up the room for questions or comments from you all.
Oh, so Gina, Tracy put a question in the chat. Can you read that for us?
Yeah, question to the presenters. Anapisi is new for Central and North. Wondering what suggestions you have for our new centers, perhaps ways to partner with the community, new curriculum, etc.
Oh, that's a good question. I think we don't know really what the center is about, so it's hard to offer suggestions. But happy to talk with Tracy in the future about that. I'm sure Erin is too. I mean, just whatever you need, I'm sure we're happy to help.
I also want to echo, Tina just put a comment that when we were in person pre-COVID for part of our Day of Remembrance ceremony on campus at Seattle Central College, we gathered around the fountain that was actually created by a Japanese American artist. And we lit candles and read the name of every student who was pulled out of classes in this moment, and acknowledge each and every one of those names. And we can't do that today virtually in Zoom, but I do want to acknowledge that that is part of our in-person ceremony that we would normally do for our Day of Remembrance programming.
So Gina, you're saying you have a list of the names of students who were incarcerated from Broadway High School in 42?
That's correct.
About how many were there, do you think? Hundreds? So must have been several hundred, right? Well, it's not a question, but almost 300, says Kayleen. Wow,
about 140 apparently.
Oh, okay, 140.
And I don't know if they're combining North, Central. Well, it was Broadway High School, but
yeah. Well, that's a great list to have. Yeah, I mean, it's great because there's a lot of, I know the Broadway High School has a yearbook committee that, I mean, alumni who've been recovering all the yearbooks and trying to do more archival stuff on Broadway. I hope they have that list too. Because like as I was fascinated in preparing for this presentation today, the many connections Broadway High School and Seattle Central had with this particular history.
Yeah, and I think when I am looking into different stories to tell, each next is more heartbreaking. I did a mural that honored the Nikkei students who were at the University of Washington at that moment, and there were more than 400 of them. And I think it's powerful for university students walking by to really understand what it means for you to, be sort of at the prime of your life. These students were, many of them, the first generation to go to college at all. And then, they were swept up and away. So just like every different moment, age group has a heartbreaking story when it comes to this history.
There is a question from the chat asking, what do you see as the best way for disseminating the history information to the broader public? We had about 170 participants today in this virtual Zoom room, but I think the question is pretty much directing the concept of how do we amplify this message?
Well, I mean, I think Erin and I are doing pretty much that kind of thing. I mean, Erin, through her public art, is reaching so many people visually, and through the written word, I've been doing my little bit, and that's the way to reach, especially with the graphic novel and the public art, to reach younger audiences who are very visual right now. I'm very active in social media, and obviously that's another way to really reach a wider audience as well. But I think as instructors at Seattle colleges, that the curriculum and teaching in courses is also getting them while they're young. And I'm very pleased to see that California and Illinois are mandating or requiring or ethnic studies and Japanese American incarceration in particular to be taught in the K through 12 secondary schools. So that's a good movement to see. And I think at the same time, we see the other movement in southern states to ban books and intimidate teachers from teaching histories like these, the 1619 Project and other histories. So it's a very fine line that educators have to walk right now, and I don't envy the task that you have.
Yeah, and I'll just add that, individuals such as ourselves and then community organizations just over these years, 80 years, have, started to pull together really intensive curricula about this history in the absence of this curricula, in standardized American education. So Densho and the Korematsu Center, it's out there. I mean, I'm not a teacher, so I don't know how difficult it is to to bring these materials into your classrooms, but there's a lot of work from written word to visual that, you can use as a resource at this point.
Yeah, Densho, just search the Densho.org for their resource guide, which Brian Nia put together, encyclopedic listing of books for young children. Jen Romo just asked, are there books for young children that share these stories that recommend? And Brian lists them all. Secondarily, Jen, I'd recommend going to the Wing Luke Museum, because the Wing Luke, published our graphic novel on Camp Resistance, which, I've seen 6th graders and 8th graders pick up the book. I mail copies to my friends, and their kids intercept the book and read it themselves. So my book is out there, and then the Wing Luke has a new book coming out this year about allies, those who helped us. And Tracy mentioned this, allies, white allies, basically. And this new book is drawn by Kiko Hughes, who did that book Displacement that was so well received last year, and is written by our friend Ken Mochizuki. So that's another book coming this fall from the Wing Luke, kind of paired with ours, that you can use to share with young readers.
Yeah, and that book talk at the Wing Luke is tonight, actually.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
I think so. And then I think there's a separate educators training around that text. So you can probably.
Oh yes, around that book and mine as well. I'm actually finalizing the study guide, the educator's guide for We Hereby Refuse. So that'll be available too.
Excellent.
Yeah.
And I would like to address a question in the chat around a recording of this presentation today. And yes, we are recording. And when the link becomes available, we will send that out. Just a reminder again, if you would like some of those printed materials of books like the ones being mentioned, please fill out the link so we can mail them to you.
Hannon asks, what happened to families after they were released? Did families become homeless? Did other ethnic groups come to support dislocated families? Yes, yes, and yes. Many families lost their homes. The Akutsus, for example, lost their home that they owned on First Hill, south of Seattle University. And they were able to scrape enough money together to buy or lease a new shoe repair shop in Chinatown on Weller Street near 6th Avenue. And they lived in the back. Mr. and Mrs. Akutsu had to live in the back. And that's where Jim Akutsu and Jean, when they got out of prison at McNeil Island, came back to find them living in the back of their shoe repair shop, which, if you read the novel John Okada's Nono Boy, you recognize as the opening scene of the novel as well. I mean, John based that on Akutsu's experience. Did families become homeless? Yes. The Japanese language school building on South Weller at Rainier, Erin's nodding her head, became a hostel, a homeless shelter, a hostel for families being released from Minidoka in 1945. And but a dozen families lived there. Two men actually took their own lives there because they were despondent over their prospects, and it became known as the Hunt Hotel. Hunt, Idaho, being the nearest city to Minidoka. So when they came to the Japanese language school, it was informally called the Hunt Hotel, but it was basically a homeless shelter. And the Quakers, American Friends Service Committee, was always supportive and reached out to the incarcerated families and provided some help to families coming back to Seattle. So thanks, Hannon.
Yeah, my family lived in the Hunt Hotel for a period of time.
Really?
Yeah, even though they were able to hold on to their house just up the street on King Street, they had a white friend who collected the rent from tenants during the war, but then those people wouldn't leave for a few months, after also rifling through all of the belongings stored in the basement and taking what they wanted. So yeah, my family stayed in the homeless shelter, like able to see their house up the street.
Unbelievable. Yeah, that's incredible.
And I wanted to mention that there's a whole other story about the after the war camps. The sites were still there and they were kept running for about a year after the war ended. However, a lot of the Japanese there didn't have anything to go back to because they'd seen their houses sold off and their land taken and all that stuff. So they just stayed put. And if essentially they had to, from Tule Lake, for instance, they had to be evicted. So they were given $10 and a train ticket and basically wherever they wanted to go in the US, and that was pretty much it. So there's a whole other story there too of about 10,000 people who were displaced that way.
Yeah, and I always think about, just the general effects of incarceration where, you're taken out of your regular life and then you sort of become, accustomed to this imprisonment and don't know how to function or don't function well when you come out. And, to me, that again, that's just another strong parallel between the history of incarceration in this country, the terrible legacy from, chattel slavery, honestly.
Thank you, Monica. Just want to draw your attention to an event this Saturday, 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. at the Puyallup Fairgrounds and Northwest Detention Center in Tacoma. All of the details are posted in the chat if you are interested.
We'll be there. I'm one of the organizers. We're going to have a really powerful ceremony honoring our ancestors and, raising our voices and drums. We'll be raising our voices a little bit more on the Tacoma side and perhaps having a more somber event on the Puyallup side. But I look forward to seeing folks, and don't hesitate to come up and say hi that you are here at this presentation and introduce yourself if you find yourself there.
I don't know much about Canadians' history, but Kayleen is mentioning that Canada did the same concept to their Japanese Canadians. And I'm not familiar with that history or stories, but I would like to learn about that. Thank you again to each of our presenters, the Day of Remembrance Committee that came together on their own time to pull this together. And again, that special thanks to South Seattle College. I very deeply always want to say community college, South Seattle College and Appeasy for supporting our guest speakers financially. Thank you to everyone in the room. We are honored by your presence. We will post the link to this recording. If JC, you can populate in the text again where it's located on the Student Leadership website. You are welcome to reference this video or use this video if you're faculty in your classrooms, if appropriate for your curriculum, or share in your communities or social networks. And again, there is a survey if you would like to receive a Seattle College's prize pack that does include printed books like the ones we were referencing today.
Thank you, Gina. I just want to say thank you to the Day of Remembrance Committee. I really admire how you educators have kind of, in an ad hoc way, banded together to have this event, and working with your college administration to make it happen. So thank you.
Thank you on behalf of everyone for participating, both of you who presented. Community voices are just so powerful, and we appreciate it very much.